Something happened in October 2025 that Microsoft had been planning for years, and it did not go the way they expected. Windows 10 officially reached the end of its life. No more free security updates, no more patches. Just a hard deadline that Microsoft had been telegraphing since 2021, designed to push the enormous installed base of Windows 10 users towards something newer, something with a redesigned interface, tighter security requirements, and increasingly, something with an artificial intelligence assistant built into almost every corner of it. And when that deadline finally arrived, the result was not the mass migration Microsoft had counted on. Instead, hundreds of millions of people looked at what was waiting for them on the other side of that deadline, and a striking number of them decided that, no, they were not going to go there. Some of them paid Microsoft $30 a year just to keep using Windows 10 a little longer. Some of them kept running an operating system with no security updates and no support, accepting the risk rather than making the jump. And some of them, in numbers that nobody in the Windows ecosystem saw coming, did something that the computing industry had been predicting as inevitable for 20 years without it ever quite happening. They installed Linux. This is the story of how Microsoft turned one of the most anticipated operating system transitions in recent history into one of the most documented cases of upgrade resistance ever recorded. What drove it, and why the people quietly switching to an open source operating system built by volunteers represents something far more significant than just a technical curiosity. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are the part that genuinely shocks everyone who looks at them closely. Dell COO Jeffrey Clark, speaking during the company's third quarter earnings call in November 2025, shared a figure that stopped a lot of people in the industry cold. We have about 500 million of them capable of running Windows 11 that haven't been upgraded, he told analysts. 500 million machines. 500 million computers that could run Windows 11 that met the hardware requirements, that had no technical reason blocking the transition, and that had simply not made the move despite Windows 10 reaching its end of life. And that was only half of the problem Clark outlined. He also revealed that another 500 million machines were sitting in what he called a kind of digital purgatory, too old, too underpowered, or missing the specific hardware requirements that Windows 11 demands, making the upgrade impossible without buying a new computer entirely. Add those two groups together, and you have what Clark described as a 1 billion device bottleneck, the largest documented case of upgrade resistance in the history of Windows, dwarfing even the notorious reluctance that users showed toward abandoning Windows XP a decade earlier, and eclipsing even the Vista disaster in terms of sheer compatible but unwilling holdouts. Clark also put the pace of this adoption in historical context that was damning for Microsoft's plans. He noted that Windows 11 adoption was running 10 to 12 percentage points, behind where Windows adoption had been at the equivalent point in the previous upgrade cycle. That's not a small gap. That's a structural problem with how users are receiving this operating system, and it has nothing to do with the technical quality of Windows 11 in isolation. It has everything to do with a question that's worth unpacking very carefully, because the answer is complicated, layered, and ultimately deeply revealing about where Microsoft has been taking Windows and where users are refusing to follow. So why exactly are 500 million capable machines sitting on an end-of-life operating system rather than making the free upgrade that Microsoft offered? The surface answer is well documented. Windows 11 shipped with hardware requirements that were, by the standards of what the industry was used to from Microsoft, unusually strict. The most contentious was the mandatory requirement for a trusted platform module chip, version 2.0, built into the motherboard. TPM chips are security hardware components that handle encryption keys and support features like secure boot and BitLocker disk encryption. They're a legitimate security improvement, and Microsoft's argument for requiring TPM 2. 0 was not without merit, but the practical consequence of that requirement was brutal for a large population of users. Computers manufactured before roughly 2017, and in some cases more recently than that, depending on the manufacturer, didn't have TPM2. 0 chips. Many of those machines were still fast, still functional, still entirely capable of handling every computing task their owners needed to do. But they were locked out of Windows 11 entirely. For a household running a perfectly good laptop bought in 2016 or 2017, Windows 11 wasn't a choice. It simply wasn't available. And Microsoft's answer to that situation was essentially buy a new computer. That answer landed very differently depending on who received it. For enterprises, it translated into enormous, unplanned refresh programs that required replacing hardware that hadn't been budgeted for replacement yet. Dell's Clark described an environment where enterprises were reluctant to absorb large, unplanned refresh programs tied closely to operating system deadlines. For everyday home users, it meant that a machine they had paid several hundred or several $1,000s for that still ran all their programs perfectly well that had no functional problems whatsoever was suddenly being told it was obsolete by the company whose operating system it had been running loyally for years. That combination of feeling, financial resentment about forced hardware replacement, combined with the specific irritation of having a machine arbitrarily declared incompatible while it was still working perfectly, is one of the most powerful catalysts for the kind of user behavior that Microsoft's adoption numbers started showing almost immediately. But the TPM requirement, as real and frustrating as it was, is only the first layer of the story. The second layer is about what users who did upgrade to Windows 11 found waiting for them, and that layer is where the trust problem begins. The Windows Central Editor-in-Chief put it with precision when he wrote in early 2026 that Windows doesn't have a feature problem, it has a trust problem. That phrase cuts through a lot of noise and gets to something real, because Windows 11, objectively assessed, is not a bad operating system in the way that Windows Vista was a bad operating system. It's faster in many workloads. Its security architecture is genuinely improved. Its interface, while divisive in terms of design choices, is functional. But the experience of using Windows 11 has been shaped by a series of decisions that feel, to a growing number of users, less like Microsoft making an operating system and more like Microsoft using an operating system to extract value from the people running it. Start with the advertising. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. Advertisements are literally inside Windows 11 in ways that have no historical precedent in a paid operating system. When Windows 10 end-of-life approached, Microsoft began showing full-screen pop-up notifications on Windows 10 machines that looked superficially like security warnings and that primarily directed users to buy new Copilot Plus PCs. These weren't subtle system tray notifications. They were full-screen takeovers of the desktop, blending legitimate security information about the end-of-life deadline with explicit promotion of a specific hardware purchase. By 2025, Microsoft was testing advertisements inside the Start menu's recommended section, pushing users toward Copilot and Microsoft 365 subscriptions. In one episode that became a flashpoint in the community, Microsoft pushed a Copilot advertisement to Windows 11 lock screens in the form of a QR code, a sizable graphical element placed directly on the screen that appears when users haven't logged in yet, which when scanned redirected them to a Copilot download page. Not even logged in, not yet doing anything, and Microsoft had placed an ad on the screen. The backlash was immediate and angry, and Microsoft withdrew the experiment. But the fact that it was attempted at all was telling, and the withdrawal didn't change the broader trajectory. As one analyst put it, Windows had become a delivery vehicle for Microsoft accounts, Edge, Bing, OneDrive, Xbox services, Microsoft 365, Copilot, widgets, recommendations, and lock screen content. And when you pay for an operating system, whether directly through a license fee or indirectly through the cost of a new PC, and then you're shown advertisements inside it, and your attention is monetized, and your usage data is collected, and you are the customer and the product and the revenue stream simultaneously, the implicit contract that you thought existed when you bought your computer starts to feel like it was never what you assumed it was. The Copilot integration specifically became a source of friction that went beyond just the ads. Microsoft added a dedicated physical Copilot key to new Windows PC keyboards, requiring manufacturers to place it on the keyboard as a condition of certain hardware partnerships. The key physically replaced a key that many users relied on for other things. The logic was branding, a physical reminder on the keyboard itself that Windows was now, in Microsoft's framing, an AI-first platform. When users complained that the key disrupted their workflows, Microsoft eventually announced in May 2026 that a future Windows 11 update would let owners remap the key to right control or the context menu key. The admission was quiet and practical, but a Windows forum analysis captured the irony precisely. Microsoft had recently run a social media campaign calling the Copilot key a fix for everything, and giving it what their marketing copy described as main character energy, even as they were quietly building an escape hatch because too many people were telling them it interrupted how they actually used their computers. Then there was recall. This was the feature that, more than any other single element of Windows 11, captured in one place every anxiety that users had been accumulating about where Microsoft was taking the operating system. Recall, announced in May 2024 as a flagship feature of Copilot Plus PCs, worked by taking periodic screenshots of everything happening on the screen, then using AI to make that captured history searchable. The pitch was that you'd be able to find anything you'd ever seen or done on your computer by describing it in natural language, as if you had a searchable memory of your entire computing history. When security researchers examined the early implementation, they found that the captured screenshots were being stored in plain, unencrypted text. Credit card numbers, medical records, private messages, passwords visible on screen for a fraction of a second, all of it being stored in a format that any piece of malware with access to the computer could read without any decryption at all. Microsoft delayed the rollout multiple times, overhauled the implementation substantially, made it fully opt-in rather than default, added encryption tied to the hardware's TPM chip and to Windows Hello biometric authentication, and eventually released it broadly in 2025 in a form that is considerably more secure than what was initially described. And the current version of Recall, when assessed technically, has real security controls, but the damage to user trust was not undone by the technical improvements. The fact that the initial design had stored a complete searchable history of your screen activity in unencrypted plain text was not a minor oversight. It was the kind of architectural decision that makes thoughtful people question whether the team building these features had been thinking about user security and privacy as a primary concern or as an afterthought to be addressed after the feature had been publicly announced. And that question, once asked, doesn't stop being relevant just because the feature was eventually fixed. All of these things together, the TPM requirement locking out millions of still functional machines, the advertisements inside a paid operating system, the full-screen hardware sales pitches dressed up as security warnings, the Copilot key replacing keys people actually used, the recall fiasco and what it revealed about feature development priorities, the persistent ambient feeling that Windows has become a platform for Microsoft's services business rather than a tool that exists to serve its users, created a psychological environment in which, for the first time in decades, a meaningful number of ordinary people started genuinely considering alternatives that they would never have previously entertained. That's where the Linux story begins, and it's a story that starts with the numbers. Global Linux desktop market share reached 4.7% in 2025, according to StatCounter data. That sounds modest in isolation, but it represents a 70% increase from the 2.76% recorded in July 2022, making it one of the fastest sustained periods of Linux desktop adoption since the operating system was introduced 3 decades ago. The United States crossed the 5% threshold for the first time in June 2025. The Zorin OS development team, makers of a Linux distribution specifically designed to look and feel familiar to Windows users, reported that more than 780,000 Windows users transitioned to their platform in the wake of the Windows 10 end-of-life announcements. That's not 780,000 tech enthusiasts who were always going to switch eventually. That's a specific documented wave of people who were using Windows, who encountered the Windows 11 transition, who decided it was not the path they wanted to take, and who chose a fundamentally different operating system as their response. Now, it's important to be clear about what these numbers actually mean and don't mean. Linux at 4.7% globally is still a distant third in the desktop market, behind Windows at roughly 70% and Mac OS at around 13%. Linux is not taking over the desktop. It is not about to surpass Windows in the next few years or even the next decade at current trajectories. What's happening is something more specific and more significant than a simple market share battle. A threshold has been crossed where Linux is no longer a fringe choice with a niche user base so small that most software companies can safely ignore it. It's approaching a scale where it represents a real, sustained segment of the computing population, and where the reasons people are choosing it tell a clear story about what they feel they're no longer getting from the Windows ecosystem. The gaming angle is particularly revealing, because for years, the most persuasive argument for staying on Windows was that it was simply the only viable platform for PC gaming. The Windows gaming library, the compatibility layer, the driver support, the sheer volume of titles that were developed for DirectX and would never run natively on anything else were a lock-in mechanism as powerful as any contractual obligation. That lock is not completely broken, but Valve changed the equation significantly with Proton, a compatibility layer built into the Steam gaming platform that allows Windows games to run on Linux without native Linux versions. Linux gaming market share on Steam reached 3.05% in October 2025, the highest level since Steam for Linux launched. The Steam Deck, Valve's handheld gaming PC that ships running Steam OS, a Linux-based operating system, has introduced Linux to an enormous population of gamers who simply use it as a gaming device and experience it as a normal functional computing environment rather than a complex technical alternative that requires expertise to navigate. One analysis noted that something important was happening in how these users perceived their relationship with Linux. Steam Deck users don't think of themselves as running Linux. They think of themselves as playing games on a device that happens to run Linux. That normalization is exactly the kind of cultural shift that precedes much larger adoption changes. When a technology stops being something you consciously choose because of ideology and starts being something you use because it's simply what's there and it works, its adoption can accelerate very rapidly. But the shift happening at the government and enterprise level in Europe is arguably more significant in the long run than anything happening in the gaming space, because it represents institutional, policy-driven momentum that doesn't reverse when a new Windows version comes out with better features. Germany's state of Schleswig-Holstein announced plans to migrate 30,000 government computers to Linux and LibreOffice, one of the largest desktop Linux deployments in the European Union. Denmark announced plans to reduce Microsoft dependency across government systems. Switzerland explored requirements for public digital infrastructure to preference open source software. These are not technology companies making choices for ideological reasons. These are governments responding to substantive concerns about data sovereignty, about what it means when your country's public administration runs on software controlled by a foreign corporation, about the practical risks of vendor lock-in when the vendor can change pricing, change terms of service, or change the product itself in ways you cannot control or predict. The concept of digital sovereignty, which sounds abstract until you think about it concretely, has been gaining serious traction in European policy circles for exactly the same reasons that individual users have been losing trust in Windows. When Microsoft introduces features that collect and process data on your device, you need to trust that those features are implemented with your privacy as the primary concern. When you're a government processing citizen data, health records, tax information, sensitive communications, that trust has to be verifiable, not just asserted. An open source operating system, one where the code can be read, audited, and independently verified by anyone with the expertise to do so, is a fundamentally different proposition from a proprietary system where you take the vendor's word for what's happening inside it. For governments that have been watching Microsoft roll out features like recall and advertising integrations, and increasingly deep AI embedding into the operating system itself, the open source alternative has started looking less like a compromise and more like a requirement. Now let's be honest about what Linux isn't, because authenticity matters more than advocacy. Linux is not a perfect operating system. It is not Windows with the annoying parts removed. The transition from Windows to Linux has real friction, and pretending otherwise would be doing a disservice to anyone considering making the move. Software compatibility is the first and most persistent challenge. The suite of Windows-specific applications, certain creative tools, certain line of business software, certain games that Proton hasn't yet made compatible, represent real gaps that affect real people's ability to do real work. Trying to run these through compatibility layers works well enough for some use cases and fails completely for others. And the failure modes can be difficult to predict without testing specifically for your setup. Hardware compatibility has improved dramatically, but it's still not universal, and the experience of discovering that your specific Wi-Fi card or your printer or your external audio interface doesn't work on Linux without configuration work that requires comfort with command line tools is a real and documented frustration. The driver situation, while much better than it was 5 years ago, still has gaps. Enterprise-grade support, while available through commercial distributions from Red Hat and Canonical, requires deliberate purchasing and planning in a way that Windows support, for all its frustrations, does not. And the sheer variety of Linux distributions, while one of the ecosystem's genuine strengths in terms of the ability to find something that perfectly matches your needs and preferences, can also be paralyzing when you're a first-time user trying to figure out where to start. Ubuntu, Fedora, Linux Mint, Pop! OS, Zorin, the differences between them are real and meaningful. But explaining why they matter to someone who just wants an operating system that works without complications requires a level of technical communication that the Linux community has historically been better at celebrating as a feature than acknowledging as a barrier for new users. What's changed, though, is the direction of the difficulty gradient. For years, the answer to the question of why someone should bother learning to navigate Linux's quirks was essentially ideological, something about freedom, about open source philosophy, about not wanting to support a monopoly. Those arguments were real and have always had genuine adherents, but they weren't sufficient to move mass adoption. What's different now is that the difficulty of switching to Linux has to be weighed against the difficulty of staying on Windows. And that difficulty has been increasing steadily. If you're running an older machine that can't meet the TPM2 0 requirement, Windows 11 isn't available to you at all, so the comparison isn't between Linux and a comfortable Windows experience. It's between Linux and either running an unsupported, unpatched operating system or paying for a new computer you didn't plan to buy. If you're running a perfectly capable machine and your primary use case is web browsing, streaming, document editing, and email, a Linux distribution like Linux Mint or Zorin OS can handle all of those tasks identically to Windows, for free, without the lock screen advertising, without the start menu promotions, without the telemetry collection you didn't opt into, and without the AI assistant being inserted into your settings, your taskbar, your lock screen, and the dedicated key on your keyboard. The word free here means more than just no financial cost, though that matters too, especially as Microsoft's move towards subscription-based services means that getting the full Windows experience increasingly involves ongoing payments for Microsoft 365, for Copilot Pro, for the extended support if you want to stay on Windows 10, Free means freedom from the incremental encroachment of a business model that has changed what an operating system is expected to do and be. It means updates that deliver security improvements and new features, not new ways to show you something Microsoft wants you to buy. It means a system where you configure it once the way you want it, and it stays that way, rather than a system where each new update is an opportunity for Microsoft's preferred defaults to reassert themselves and require another round of turning off the things you already turned off last time. The trust issue that Windows Central's editor articulated so cleanly is ultimately a story about a changed relationship between a software company and its users. Microsoft's current business model depends on Windows being a platform, not just an operating system. A platform serves multiple constituencies simultaneously. It serves the end user who needs a computing environment, but it also serves advertisers. By delivering their messages to that user, it serves Microsoft's own services business by providing the most prominent possible real estate for promoting those services, and it serves Microsoft's data infrastructure by feeding user behavior and usage patterns into the systems that power Copilot and other AI features. When all of those interests align perfectly, the user benefits and the platform succeeds. When they conflict, the platform's internal logic tends to favor the interests that are paying Microsoft money, which are the advertising and services interests, over the interests of the end user, who already paid for their computer and is not generating additional revenue by simply using it without buying anything else. This is not unique to Microsoft. It is a structural feature of how the largest technology companies have organized their businesses in the era of big data and AI. The user isn't just a customer anymore. The user is a data asset, an attention resource, a potential subscriber, a target for upsell. Every feature that makes it more convenient for Microsoft to know what you're doing on your PC is also a feature that makes you more valuable to Microsoft's broader business. Recall is the most obvious example, but the same logic applies to Copilot embedding, to telemetry collection, to advertising ID tracking, to the integration of Microsoft's cloud services into the default experience in ways that are technically opt-out but practically sticky, because most users never look for the settings that would let them opt out. And this is precisely the dynamic that Linux's growth in 2025 and into 2026 is a reaction to. Not a reaction in the sense of a political boycott, not primarily ideological, not driven by activists making a statement. A reaction in the sense of millions of ordinary people doing a practical calculation and concluding that the balance of what they get and what they give up in the Windows ecosystem no longer adds up the way it used to. For some of them, the TPM requirement made the calculation simple and binary. For others, it was the accumulation of small irritations, the lock screen ad, the start menu promotion, the Copilot key that replaced their right control key, the recall announcement that made them wonder what else was being captured and stored without adequate protection. For others still, it was the moment they realized that their Windows 10 machine, the one they were perfectly happy with, was being held hostage until they either bought new hardware or paid an annual fee for the privilege of continuing to receive security patches. The people running Linux now are not the same people who ran Linux 10 years ago. That population was almost entirely technical. Specialists, developers, system administrators, security researchers, people who used Linux because it was the right tool for professional work and who were comfortable navigating its complexities because they understood them deeply. The people downloading Zorin OS and Linux Mint and Ubuntu today include a much broader and more diverse range of users, people who just want a computer that works and doesn't treat them as a resource to be optimized. They're finding that, in many respects, particularly for the most common computing tasks, the experience is smoother than they expected. The installation process has become considerably more straightforward. The hardware detection is more reliable. The software available for everyday tasks, including web browsers, office suites, media players, email clients, and communication tools, covers most of what most people do with a computer most of the time. The number that will define whether this moment becomes something historically significant in computing or remains a notable but ultimately modest shift in the margin is how many of the 100 million users on older hardware that can't run Windows 11 ultimately choose Linux over paying for extended support or replacing their machines. 780,000 people switching to Zorin OS represents a real and meaningful wave, but it's a fraction of the potential population. If even 10% of users with Windows 11 incompatible machines decided that Linux was the right next step, that would represent tens of millions of new Linux users entering the ecosystem in a compressed period, which would represent a permanent and structural change in the developer attention that the Linux ecosystem receives, the commercial software that gets ported to it, and the hardware support that manufacturers decide to provide for it. There is also a longer-term dynamic worth watching, which is what happens to the users who've already made the transition. The consistent finding from surveys of Linux migrants is that the reversal rate is low. People who switch to Linux and stay on it for more than 6 months rarely go back to Windows voluntarily. The combination of not paying for an operating system, not dealing with advertising in the UI, having an update mechanism that doesn't force restart at inopportune moments, and having a system configured exactly the way they set it up without constant reversion to vendor defaults creates a user satisfaction profile that's remarkably sticky. And sticky users who are satisfied with their platform become advocates. They help their friends set up Linux. They answer questions in online communities. They normalize the option for people in their lives who would never have considered it otherwise. What's happening right now with Windows 11 adoption, or more accurately, the refusal of Windows 11 adoption, is one of the most concrete examples in recent computing history of what happens when a company overestimates its users' tolerance for having their computing experience reorganized around the company's business interests. 500 million capable machines that haven't upgraded. Windows 11 market share falling after peaking in October 2025. Windows 10 share growing even after its end-of-life date. Even Windows 7 showing a small but notable increase in share, which means there are people so resistant to what awaits them that they're staying on an operating system from 2009 rather than finding out. Linux growing 70% in 3 years and crossing the 5% threshold in the United States for the first time ever. This is not a technology story about which operating system has better features. It's a relationship story about trust, about what users feel they owe an operating system vendor and what that vendor owes them, and about what happens when the answer to the second question stops being what users expected. Microsoft built one of the most valuable and dominant technology platforms in human history by making a computer something ordinary people could use without being experts. The thing that is now driving a measurable, documented, historically unprecedented wave of users toward an open source alternative is the slow reversal of that relationship. The gradual conversion of a tool that existed to serve its users into a platform that expects its users to serve it. Whether Microsoft can reverse that dynamic, or whether 2025 and 2026 will be looked back on as the inflection point where the long-predicted but never quite arriving Linux moment finally started, is the question that the next several years will answer in data that doesn't lie.